Welcome to Contrarian Humanitarian, your blog and podcast for all things international development, analyzing global injustices and building solutions for a better world. Hello. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. Welcome to episode 2 of Contrarian Humanitarian. I am Erin Edmiston, your host, and I am joined with co-host and producer Mikey Pogolov.
Hello, nice to be here.
Awesome. So I'd just like to give us kudos for getting all this ready prior to the start of the show, unlike last time. So I listened and I learned. Today we have a very important episode with a very special guest. His name is Dan Kovalik. He is a lawyer, professor, and author of many books, but his latest book, which we're going to be speaking specifically about, is called No More War: How the West Violates International Law by Using Humanitarian Intervention to Advance Economic and Strategic Interest. Big title, not too lengthy of a book. He really packs in a lot of information and about 316 pages, at least on my version. But so much information, and we're going to try to get into as much as we can today. We're having Dan on to talk about his latest book and this topic because it is an incredibly important conversation, war, being anti-war, and understanding the history and current affairs that of America that they engage in around the world militarily. And as someone that has been in refugee resettlement for a number of years, and also both Mikey and I come from military families. This conversation is incredibly heavy and incredibly real and incredibly important. And so that's why we're just taking a few minutes before Dan comes on in about 15 minutes to talk about his book, because when we're talking about war, that means catastrophe of human life, catastrophe of civilization, catastrophe of our psyche, where the war is taking place, but also who is perpetrating it and what happens to those, what happens to Americans here when we are spending so much money on war abroad. And of course, what is happening to the countries that America is bombing. This is a bit heavy conversation, but very important. One of the reasons, I guess, we kind of want to take this time also to talk about a little backstory about Contrarian Humanitarian and myself. Like I mentioned, I've been in refugee resettlement for a number of years. I've worked with Church World Service and International Rescue Committee. All of my views are my own. I do not represent any entity. Most recently, I worked for International Rescue Committee for a short stint, and I recently left my position in June. I was managing a small team of caseworkers who we provide the on-the-ground initial resettlement services when refugees come to this country. There are a lot of things happening at my time at IRC. Two of those things being the pandemic and the heightened Black Lives Matter movement after George Floyd. And throughout these events and other things that IRC, has said and does, I felt like I could no longer work there because I didn't feel like the office I was in or the organization fit my values. And I made the decision to leave during a pandemic because the situation, I was so distraught with what I was seeing and what I thought we should be doing and what we should be saying. And so Contrarian Humanitarian, has grown from a lot of things, but definitely this last experience with IRC. And that's, why we're doing Contrarian Humanitarian, because we believe in calling out injustices perpetrated by the international development and humanitarian sector. There are, of course, beautiful people in these sectors doing amazing work, and this is not downplaying any of that. But in my opinion, there's too little critique of the humanitarian sector. And I think oftentimes when laborers of the humanitarian sector speak out, their voice is largely hushed or just swallowed up in sort of corporate INGO rhetoric. And so Contrarian Humanitarian is here to talk about the humanitarian sector, talk about the injustices perpetrated, and eventually we want to mobilize, humanitarian sector and allies to change the system and completely dismantle it if necessary. So, Mikey, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. So before we bring Dan on, we had been kind of throwing around the idea of doing a bit of an expose on some of these INGOs, and we figured why not start with International Rescue Committee. And this is just some preliminary research I've been doing a little bit on. We're going to talk a little more on the show, and hopefully we'll have an article on this eventually.
Yeah, do you want to bring up your...
Yeah.
Mikey made this great sort of map on Little Sis.
Yeah.
And it's kind of cool because he, making a mind map of all the connections, but you can also put different players in. And I think, as he'll try to demonstrate, see the connections of politicians have with different entities within IRC. And again, this is preliminary research. We're not making definitive connections or, what is really going on behind doors. But as you'll see with these mind maps, or maybe I don't know if it's it's not a mind map, but as you'll see with his map, there are a huge number of board of directors at the International Rescue Committee. I don't know why there are so many. This is just the board of directors, correct? There's also a board of advisors.
This is just the board of directors.
Right.
And if I can explain, I know it's a bit hard to see. This isn't the best software for displaying this, but what I've done here is from the left over, everybody on top here are board of directors. From the left over are people who you might expect to be in these kind of positions. You have Janet Napolitano. You might have heard of her. A bunch of, big names, sort of nonprofit doctors, the kind of people you might expect. Everybody to the right is basically in finance. Big time, major financial people, and we'll get into that a little bit more in just a second.
Tim Geithner, most notably.
Well, in the middle, the co-chairs are Tim Geithner and Sally Sussman. Sussman appears, this is all, again, very quick preliminary research, appears to have sort of a government bureaucrat kind of background, but she is currently some kind of executive at Pfizer. And the other co-chair is Tim Geithner, who is probably most well known for overseeing the bailout under Obama, really the second wave of bailouts. He wasn't there for the first one because there was a transition from Bush to Obama. But he's also a big-time Wall Street guy. He has the most connections of anybody in this map to all kinds of organizations, financial and otherwise. We have some think tanks over here. The think tanks are important too because that's the kind of connection to the defense contractors. I guess I forgot to add those, but they're down here and they run through here. And one of them, Raytheon has major stock holdings from BlackRock. BlackRock is one of the biggest hedge funds in the world. They control $4 trillion worth of capital. And it was started solely by this Lawrence Fink guy, who he's the founder, CEO, and chairman of BlackRock. And he's on the board of directors for IRC, a guy who essentially owns a big chunk of Raytheon. And BlackRock does other funding for the defense industry in general through, I think, something called the U.S. Aerospace and Defense Fund, something like that. Anyway, so yeah, there's that. Again, this is all just sort of loose preliminary research, but I think when you look at this map and you see more than half of these people are basically just big finance people.
And why do we have, again, a reasoning for contrarian humanitarian is to try to look at these things and pick them apart and ask questions, because all humanitarians or people in these sectors should be asking these questions. Why does, an International Rescue Committee is one of the largest international non-governmental organizations in the world. So, it's a huge organization, probably takes a lot of people to man it, but why are so many financiers involved? Particularly someone that oversaw a complete failure of a bailout to the American people. So I don't know how great they will be in giving advice on provision of resources.
Yeah, and the direct connection to these, there's only one major direct connection to the defense contractors, but there's a lot of ancillary ones. And even if people aren't directly thinking like, oh, we have to think about the defense contractors, there's going to be conflicts of interest and overlapping, even subconscious level things going on. But just the whole idea of having any connection between defense contractors and the people who are doing the work for refugee crises is just crazy, especially because they pretend that they are apolitical, which I guess brings us to the last guy, the head of IRC, the CEO, David Milliband. Milliband has this past in government and British government. He supported a number of wars at the time, right? Iraq and Syria later on, I think.
Yeah, I have to double check his position. So I think maybe he was mayor of London or something, maybe. I'm not exactly sure at the time when U.S. wanted to invade Iraq. And he did support it on a number of occasions. I believe he did actually vote for it. And then also, Syria comes along, and he was a proponent of intervention in Syria. And two things before Dan comes on, I just want to plug the activists, our friends Haley and Patrick at the Activist. They interviewed us.
APP, Activist.
Correct. Thank you. They interviewed us on their podcast series called Bits of Good. The Activist is a platform that Haley has created to try to connect people doing, all sorts of good works and good deeds, and people that are interested in how they can join. So essentially just a platform for people that are doing good things and how you can join and learn more about them. And I think it's a really great initiative. So check out that. We'll talk a little bit. They're releasing a podcast episode where they interviewed Mikey and I, where we talk a little bit more about this, and also my IRC experience and the reasoning for creating Contrarian Humanitarian. And again, David Milliband supporting war on multiple occasions, supporting intervention, being the head or eventually becoming the head of the largest refugee resettlement organization. We have to call this into question, absolutely. And I called it into question, and I left the IRC because of it, among many things. And I'm so excited. So let's bring on Dan, who wrote a whole book about American using quote unquote humanitarian intervention, essentially to advance their economic and strategic interest.
Yeah. And I just want to point out one more connection with Milliband. I don't know if he's still with Center for American Progress, but it's a major think tank. This is the think tank that Neera Tanden is, I think, the president of, and who was just appointed by Biden to, I think, the Office of Budget Management position. There's a lot to say about that. I'm sure Dan can add to that. I'm going to hop out when Dan comes in, but if y'all need any links or anything, whatever, let me know and I'll pop them in welcome Dan Kovalik, everybody.
Yay!
Hey! Sorry, my hair is a little
Oh, it looks great.
crazy.
Looks great.
All right. There you go. That's a little better.
Oh, I love the festivity.
Yeah, I tried to set up a nice scene for you there.
I love it.
To look at. Yeah.
How are you?
Good. How are you, Aaron? Thanks for having me on. I really appreciate it.
Oh, well, we appreciate you. And again, I said this before, but we appreciate your work, putting this out there. Your book is just incredibly important and filled with so much information. When I was reading it, I was upset and angry and scared and sad, emotional. There's just so much into it. And I thank you so much for your contribution and putting this work out there because it's incredibly important.
Thank you, Aaron. I really appreciate that.
So I kind of, we were sort of sharing a bit about my time at IRC and deciding to leave because I felt like the culture of the office and the organization were sort of out of sync with my values. And you bring up in your book the banality of evil, this concept, the banality of evil, and people who we trust, with suits and degrees to lead us in the right direction and are sort of hiding in plain sight. And maybe this doesn't speak to your personal journey, but if it does, would you be willing to share a personal story of yours and kind of facing the banality of evil, or just maybe something that you've come up against and felt was out of line with your values and had to kind of, in any insight you've gained from that, those experiences?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'll just give you a little, walkthrough of how I got to where I am today. So my kind of evolution, if I could call it that, began really in Nicaragua in the 1980s. Like a lot of people from the U.S., Canada, Europe. I went to Nicaragua during the Contra War. The U.S. was backing the Contras, which were these they were a terrorist organization. They never gained any ground against the Sandinista government that Reagan was trying to overthrow. They never could. They had no popular support. So they were tasked by the CIA, who directed them, to go destroy hospitals, kill doctors, kill teachers. They killed an American engineer named Ben Linder, who was there trying to help out during that period. They assassinated him. The U.S. mined Nicaragua's harbors at the time. It's a very cruel war against a very poor country at that time of less than 3 million people. I mean, can you imagine that? I mean, and then when you go there, and I did, also it was a very young country. Most of the people there, I think certainly well over 50% were under the age of 18. So basically it's a country of children who didn't have shoes on their feet and that were trying to build a new society after overthrowing a U.S.-backed dictator in Anastasio Somoza. And because they overthrew a U.S.-backed dictator, the U.S. punished them very hard, and they continue to with sanctions. And we can get more into that. But I went to Nicaragua. I was in a transformative period. I grew up very conservative in a very kind of right-wing Catholic household. I believed that my country was, basically good, though it made mistakes once in a while. And I supported Ronald Reagan. I thought he was this crusader against, communism and a defender of the Christian faith and all this. And that started to fall apart for me even in high school. But going to Nicaragua, it really accelerated my views on the world. And, what I saw and what a lot of people saw were these very poor people who by and large, by the way, especially at that time, were Catholic. Like 90% were Roman Catholic. And the U.S. was terrorizing them. And they could barely defend themselves, And it made me question my entire worldview. At that point, I gave up the idea that my country was basically good and that it was basically a good force in the world. And that was a profound thing. And it was still the Cold War. And the other thing it did was I witnessed, East Germans down there helping the Sandinistas, Cuba, and the Soviet Union. And basically, at that point, I switched sides. I basically joined the other team, and decided that we were, well, in the words of Daniel Ellsberg, he said, "It's not that the U.S. is on the wrong side; we are the wrong side."
Yeah, I liked that you had that quote in your book. That was very appropriate.
So that's, I guess, the long story. I don't know if that deals so much with the banality of evil, but
it doesn't have to, but yeah.
It shows the progress that I had. I will tell you an interesting little story, and this is, I don't know what you'll make of this, but again, I don't know. I guess I'm not religious anymore, but I still have a certain, I guess, spirituality. And I have found in my life that there's been a lot of things leading me in the direction that they have come to. And I did have this interesting experience. So when I was about 11, I guess, I was in this little Catholic school called St. Andrews in Milford, Ohio, this little town outside Cincinnati. And I went to this school with about 50 kids in the entire school, this little school. And in the fall of 1979, 2 new students came to our school, and they were Nicaraguan. Their name was Juan and Carlos Garcia. And at the time, this didn't mean much to me, but in retrospect, they were incredibly tall and big people for being Nicaraguans. Juan became the center of our basketball team. In fact,
oh, wow.
If you go to Central America, I mean, generally people there are smaller, mostly because of, not being properly nourished and whatnot. They also spoke perfect English. And at some point I became curious about them. And I said, well, why'd you come to, the United States? And they said, well, our dad was the president of Nicaragua, and over the summer, he was overthrown in a revolution. They were the sons of Anastasio Somoza, who was overthrown by the Sandinistas. So that was an interesting thing, you know. But the other, maybe more profound thing that really set me on the journey that brought me here, again, and it relates to me being raised a very devout Catholic, was that a little later, about a year later, Archbishop Romero was killed in El Salvador. And I was watching 60 Minutes. I was a pretty precocious kid. And I was watching 60 Minutes, and they indicated that it very well might have been U.S.-backed forces that killed Romero. And then a few months later, these American church women were killed, raped, and murdered, again, by who we know now were U.S.-backed forces, same people who killed Romero. And one of the women was from Cleveland, Ohio, and this really stuck in my craw. Like, I thought we were out there defending the Christians from the godless Reds, right? Mm-hmm. And here we're murdering religious people. And, Archbishop Romero is now a saint in the Roman Catholic Church. He's now Saint Oscar Romero as of, I believe, last October. So literally the U.S. was party to murdering a saint. And, as I right? I mean, and actually helped make him a martyr and a saint, in a certain sense. And, if you study U.S. history in Latin America, what you'll see is beginning in the 1960s. And Noam Chomsky interestingly talks a lot about this. When I met him, and the one time I met him was at his office at MIT in Boston, and he only had one poster on his wall, and it was of Archbishop Romero and the 6 Jesuits who were murdered in 1989, again by U.S.-backed forces, along with their housekeeper and her daughter. And as you study this, and again, Chomsky really got me into seeing this, the U.S. tried to, and in fact, effectively did eradicate the popular church in Latin America through murder, through mass murder of priests, nuns, an occasional bishop. And this blew my mind. Again, when I really realized that it was being done on a systemic level, and that was in college, that was it for me. Like, this is crazy. Like, what? Everything that I believed in was the opposite of what it was. Which I think gets us into this idea of humanitarian interventionism. I guess that's a long way of getting into that.
Yeah.
And again, it took me a while to see through that too. It took me longer. So when I went to law school, I went to law school in 1990 to 1993. So, which for you probably seems like a millennium ago, but for me it seems almost like yesterday. But even at that time, my goal, I went to law school specifically for the goal of working for a human rights NGO like an Amnesty International.
Yeah.
And that was my goal throughout law school and even into my career. I ultimately did not do that, but not for want of trying. I sent a lot of resumes to this, but I didn't get a job, and I ended up working for the Steelworkers Union. But the point is, even for years while I was at the union, I continued to send resumes to those organizations. I continue to want to do that. And like a lot of people, every time the U.S. would wage a war, for example, like in Yugoslavia, and that was beginning to happen under Clinton in the 90s, and it reached its apex in, I believe, 99 when NATO had its 72-day bombing raid. Even at that time, I didn't know what to make of it. I was taken in to some extent by the idea that we were there to defend human rights. And again, it wasn't till a number of years later that I realized that was not true. And then, in fact, NATO itself violated human rights on a large, massive scale, violated Geneva Convention on a mass scale by targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure in Serbia. But it took a long time for that to sink in. I think that humanitarian interventionism, in my experience, is one of the most powerful religions for liberals in the West.
Yeah, that's a good statement. It's really clouded. Thank you so much for sharing your story. And, what you're saying about always, wanting to, you were going to law school to try to do good work, presumably, but, also wanting to get into this humanitarian sector. And so many people, including myself, are like that, because I sort of thought, okay, if I live in this capitalistic society and I have to spend most of my time working, I would like to use most of my time towards a greater purpose, and I still feel that way, but, it is amazing to me, you're right, that but even people in these spaces believe in humanitarian intervention, even though you see the ramifications of what is happening to these people and on the ground. And that's a sort of a cognitive dissonance I don't really understand and want to keep speaking to and about. And again, why I love your book, because it's confusing,
and it's meant to be.
Yeah.
It's meant to fool you.
Right.
And this kind of gets into the banality of evil, that the people who are promoting it are people who seem like very respectable people. They all went to Harvard. They're all very smart. They're all very handsome and very pretty. and well dressed and well groomed and well spoken, and with a certain track record that seems good, at least on the surface. They're largely, many times, people you voted for in Bill Clinton, Barack Obama. So they're people you would tend to trust and that you want to trust, right? Because that's the thing about cognitive dissonance. You know, when you commit to something or someone and you give money to someone, for example, for their campaign, and maybe you go door to door for that person. And I did that for Obama in 2008. My whole family did. We're very excited about him. I gave a lot of money. I raised money for him. When you do that, when you invest in someone, in some cause, you want to believe in them, right? And you kind of look the other way when they do this and that. And so, again, that's quite natural for people. And so what you find with people is that, for example, when George W. Bush wanted to go into Iraq, and that was clearly based on a lie, right? The weapons of mass destruction weren't there. And most of us knew this, even though, again, the New York Times, the paper that a lot of my friends trust, like a Bible, was probably more than any other media source promoting this through a reporter named Judith Miller, who ends up being exposed as a fraud. She was basically taking information from the CIA that was bogus and printing it verbatim in her columns, right?
Yeah.
She ends up getting fired, in fact, forced to resign from the Times. But again, after the fact, that's the thing. After the fact, a lot of people say, we got fooled. And we won't get fooled again, but then we are fooled the next time.
Right. I think that's one thing I really love about your book is that you go into, and you even say that the only time the U.S. wasn't engaged in war was during Carter. Is that correct?
That's what Carter claims, right?
Well, that's what Carter.
Yeah.
Right.
And that's not even true, but yeah.
Right. So I kind of wanted to poke into that a little bit, but I do think about pointing out grievances, war crimes committed by Democrats is incredibly important, especially now that we have a Democrat coming into office. And in terms of liberal media, I think what you hear a lot is, okay, now back to normal, this sort of thing. And I think really pointing out these heinous war crimes that have been committed by the Obama-Biden administration is so crucial to try to, if we're going to hold anybody's feet to a fire, some semblance, we have to understand this history. And, speaking of history, you start your book in the Congo. And so I know you've talked about this before, but I was wondering if you could, again, lay out humanitarian intervention, the first sort of modern form that we're hearing it from King Leopold. Because, again, when it comes to war and refugee resettlement, one of the largest populations that we receive in the United States is from Congo. And so the interactions between the United States and the Congo are incredibly important, and they have been going on for, a long time. So if you could kind of start us at sort of modern day humanitarian intervention, how they hoodwink us, how they get us to believe that intervention is spreading of peace rather than ravaging peace. And then I'd love to get into the more nitty gritty international legal stuff, because I find that really interesting. So
great. Yeah. So beginning in the 19th century, King Leopold of Belgium, he sets his sights on what was then known as simply Congo. And, it was then, and it is now, I believe the largest African country by landmass, or certainly one of them.
Yeah.
And certainly one of the richest countries mineral-wise on Earth, and has some minerals that you need for computers, cell phones that you can get almost nowhere else. Okay. That's today. But back then, what they had that people wanted was rubber, because now that's starting to be used for tires and that sort of thing. And ivory, which people have coveted for a long time. So these are the two things Leopold wants. Mm-hmm. And he decides to tell the world, and he actually sends emissaries around the world to have cocktail parties with the rich and famous and politicos in D.C., very much like things happen today, right?
Yeah.
To raise money for his effort to what he says is, protect the human rights of the Congolese. In this case, he's going to protect them, he claims, from Arab slave traders. And there were Arab slave traders in the Congo, so it wasn't completely made up, except that he had no intention of protecting them from the Arab slave traders. His intention was to enslave them himself, which he did under the guise of humanitarianism. And he fooled people for a very long time. And in the process, he killed, and this is a very well accepted number, 10 million Congolese, or half their population, in one of the greatest mass murders, in human history, all in the name of human rights. Now, eventually there were honest intellectuals at the time, and there's very few now, by the way. But back then there were, and there was one named Mark Twain, and he figured out what was happening in the Congo, and he wrote a poem, in fact, dealing with it to King Leopold. And people like Twain, they exposed what was happening. And they formed the Anti-Imperialist League. And they convinced, the world community to act against Leopold and to take Congo away from Leopold. Though, sadly, what that meant was basically just giving it to Belgium, right? The hope was that Belgium as a state, as opposed to Leopold as, an individual, would act more kindly in Belgium. I think that turned out not to be largely true. But I think this is, one of the first times that you had this openly humanitarian intervention, and you also had people exposing it, so there's a lot to be learned from that episode. Now, so it goes into the hands of the Belgians in the
sorry to interrupt you. I just want to add too, in this relationship with the U.S. and Congo, something I learned from your book is that the U.S. was the first to recognize King Leopold as the leader over a sovereign Congo, or just the Kingdom of Congo.
That's correct. And that was critical, that they convinced, the U.S. to diplomatically recognize Leopold's fiefdom over the Congo. And that was critical for Leopold. That's what gave him diplomatic cover. And then, of course, other countries quickly followed. Yes, that was very important. And this begins a fateful relationship between the U.S. and Belgium in the Congo. So the Belgians, after Leopold, again, continue to exploit the Congo. And then in 1960, finally, you have this anti-colonial movement after World War II, which, of course, the U.S. opposed in every country practically. And that has to be pointed out. And the Soviet Union, to its great credit, supported the anti-colonial struggle. And that's what the Cold War ends up being about, by the way. It ends up being, it's said to be about capitalism and communism, and it was about that to some extent, but it was more about the fight for the Third World to throw off their colonial chains. And the U.S. did everything it could to prevent that, and the Soviet Union did, considerable amount to help those countries. In Congo, in 1960, you had the first democratic election of the Congolese people, and they elected a prime minister named Patrice Lumumba. And even before he's elected, and certainly after, the Belgians and the United States try to undermine him, try to prevent him from getting elected. When he is elected, they try to undermine him, and ultimately they assassinate him in what is known as the most important assassination of the 20th century. Because this is seen as really the one moment in Congo's history where Congo could have gone independent and had a progressive development. The murder of Lumumba prevents this, and the US and Belgium install in his stead Mobutu, a dictator, a very brutal dictator who, again, continues to rule Congo, which he renamed Zaire, in the interest of the West, in particular Belgium and the United States. He guarantees that their economic interests are secure there. And then in the early 90s, Mobutu himself becomes unreliable for the West. Why? Because he decides that the winds of changes are coming to Africa and to Zaire, and he's got to do something for his people, or he's going to get thrown out by his own people. So he starts taxing international businesses, tries to create some social programs, and that's enough. So the CIA gets rid of Mobutu. And then you have Laurent Kabila, who is installed. He proves very quickly to be unreliable as well, so he's off. And then his son is put in power, Joseph Kabila, again, by the United States, by Bill Clinton. And he is the current leader of what is now called the Democratic Republic of Congo. And he continues to allow the DRC to be exploited by the Western world for these minerals like tungsten and cobalt and others, diamonds, gold. And what should be said that during this transition period between his father being in power and Joseph Kabila being in power, the U.S. under Clinton militarily supports a number of, I think it's 17, don't hold me to that number, but certainly over a dozen African countries to invade Congo, to plunder their resources. This is known as the First African World War. You've ever heard of that? I mean, before you read my book, probably not. You're not taught about this in school. And in the process, 6 million Congolese are killed. 6 million. And the deaths, the murders of Congolese continues to this day with the U.S. support.
Yes.
And again, and a big supporter of it, by the way, a big person very critical to all this was Susan Rice, who's going to be in the Biden administration. She gave diplomatic cover to the invasion of Congo. She actually kept secret for years these UN mapping reports that showed what was happening, that showed that these alleged guerrilla groups in Congo who claimed to be indigenous Congolese freedom fighters were in fact being backed, again, by Rwanda, Uganda, that in turn were being backed by the United States. And she deep-sixed those reports, and then finally they were leaked. But she deep-sixed them to continue to allow the brutal exploitation of the Democratic Republic of Congo, and we see this to this day. And what was done in Congo, Democratic Republic of Congo, under Bill Clinton, with the help of Susan Rice, again was done in the name of human rights and humanitarianism. And
yeah, so we can think we can thank King Leopold for his invention of modern day humanitarian intervention, which the U.S. has co-opted and used around the world, essentially, as you were just saying, with Susan Rice deep sixing, a war into Congo. And again, coming from my perspective of being in refugee resettlement and seeing all these people come in, that have faced such horrific events, and wanting to assist them in any way that I can. This is one of the things that I think is most appropriate to do, is to call out these connections and to call out this history. And, not just working with people from DRC or the Congo, but people, you go into so many countries in your book. And I think, the U.S. has bases in how many countries is it? Is it 80 or?
Well, it's more than that. I think it's something like 135 or something like that. We have at least 800 bases around the world, at least, probably over 1,000. I mean, it's incredible that we don't even know, but that's how extensive they are.
Right. So, now we kind of know humanitarian intervention's falsehood. If we could get into the legal terms of the, because the main, part of your book is about how America is violating all these international laws. And so if we could kind of talk about what are those laws that America is violating and how are they violating them? And particularly, I think Afghanistan is interesting because in common, you'll hear like, oh, well, we should have invaded Afghanistan because they attacked us. So we had every right, and you really, I like this about your book, that you really break down, because there's not that many things within international, like there's just a few guardrails. It's kind of seems like they're sort of all encompassing, but even with those guardrails, America just takes, it doesn't matter, what the international law says. So if you could just kind of break down, like, crimes, what are some war crimes that the UN Charter sets out, and kind of how has America broken those?
So first and foremost, and if you want to call it a guardrail, and I think that's a good metaphor, the main guardrail that was set up by the United Nations when it was created after World War II was the prohibition against aggressive war. And why? Because the founders of the UN and the justices at Nuremberg believed, quite correctly, I think, that war, and the war that Germany started in the 1930s, was the font of all the crimes the Nazis ended up committing. That there wouldn't have been no Holocaust, for example, without the aggressive war against countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia, and then a number of others, right? That it was war that was the tree, and the war crimes that followed was the bitter fruit from that. So their goal in creating the UN and the UN Charter was to prevent war. And we see this throughout the UN Charter. Article 2.4 that says prohibits the use of force and the threat of force.
Right.
Article 2.7 that prohibits the interference of one country in the domestic affairs of another. And there are very slim exceptions to this. One is Article 51, which says that essentially it still honors the right to self-defense in the case of an armed attack. But even then, you can only respond in a proportional and necessary way, enough to defend yourself temporarily until you can go to the Security Council and have them decide what is to happen to deal with this breach of the peace, right? And so the entire legal system created by the UN is one that primarily is to prevent war. Again, knowing that once a war starts, and this is what people have to get their head around, once the war starts, the things the human rights groups are reporting on and upset about begin. And that is the murder of civilians and the destruction of life-saving infrastructure like water systems and sewage systems and electrical systems, and torture and rape. All those things inevitably follow from war. And so to not be opposed to war is, one, not to understand at all the legal system that we live on.
Right.
But it's also not to understand you cannot support human rights and be indifferent to war. And yet, what the U.S. has done in particular, the West has done, but the U.S. leading the charge on this, what they've done is a few things. They have essentially, through their conduct, intentional conduct, particularly beginning with Bill Clinton, they have destroyed, in spirit, the prohibition on aggressive war. It's still the letter of the law. It still exists. It's still in the UN Charter. But they essentially have said, we're not going to abide by that. And we're not even going to go to the Security Council to get authorization to invade a country that never invaded us. And that's practically every time the U.S. There is no justification for this. But what the U.S. also has done is convince people that they are doing it to defend human rights, and so therefore they have a legal and moral right to do that. There is no legal right to do it. That has to be pointed out.
Yeah, that's such a critical part of your book. Though it's like
it's made up.
Yeah,
I was on an interview on a podcast about 3 weeks ago or something by a very smart, guy. I won't call him out, but a very smart guy, very leftist guy, worldly guy, who said, "So tell me about the responsibility to protect, which is this
R2P,
Humanitarian Interventionist doctrine." He says, "Isn't that part of the UN Charter?" And I said, "Absolutely not. You will not find you will not find that concept in the UN Charter, either in spirit or in letter." And by the way, every time, international bodies like the International Court of Justice, also known as the World Court, when they've opined on this issue, they've explicitly said there is no such thing. And the big case that says this is Nicaragua versus the United States.
Oh yeah, I was gonna okay, we're on the same wavelength, because I didn't know about this with Nicaragua, and this is one of my questions I wanted to ask you, because okay, we have these international laws set up. America is not party to some of them. They don't follow them. And this was explicitly in Nicaragua, right? Where you're just saying they had the court and they said, not only must you, do X, Y, and Z, part of it is reparations. They asked for reparations. And America just said, hell no, we're not doing it. And I kind of, this is sort of like a thought question for you of like, what do we even do about this? What do we do with such, as people say, a rogue state,
Well, this is right. Well, that's a good question. So, and I will get to that in a second. Let me just talk a little bit about the case of Nicaragua versus the United States. It is considered the most important international law case, okay? And not just because I like it, because it involves Nicaragua, which I was intimately involved in, but because it created a real jurisprudence on very important issues. And this case involved Nicaragua's taking the U.S. to the International Court of Justice, the court that is really the highest court in the world, that's created by the UN Charter. It's created right after World War II to deal with disputes between states. And the idea is, and I'm going to date myself a little here, but we used to have a show that everyone loved, the People's Court, when I was growing up, and the tagline for the show was, don't take the law into your own hands, take them to court. And that was the idea here. Don't go to war with each other. Go to the court, and they'll resolve your dispute peacefully. Again, this is all in keeping with the idea that we want to prevent war, right? Mm-hmm. So Nicaragua takes the U.S. to the court to challenge the U.S.'s support of the Contras and the mining of the harbors, all these things that I mentioned. And the U.S.'s response is to say, okay, we're not even going to go. We're not going to even show up to this court. Even though we're a member of the UN Charter or the United Nations, we were one of the prime drafters of the UN Charter. We're a party to the UN Charter. We're a party to the statute on the International Court of Justice, right? Mm-hmm. We're not going. You guys, and we don't even think you have jurisdiction because we're not coming. Well, the court deals with that. They find they do have jurisdiction. And they rule against the U.S. on nearly all the counts. And in doing so, one of the things they say, so since the U.S. doesn't show up, the court actually goes through all the defenses that they think the U.S. would make based on things that the U.S. would
Oh, my God. Wow.
And one of them they say is, well, the U.S. is claiming, the Reagan administration is claiming that they're doing what they're doing in Nicaragua to defend human rights. They get into this, right? And defend democracy and all this. And what we hold, the International Court of Justice, is that would not be a basis ever for engaging in the acts you're engaging in.
Right. Because it doesn't exist.
It doesn't exist. And we don't think it furthers human rights, by the way.
Exactly. Yes.
You don't advance human rights through war, through terror, that sort of thing. Okay, so this is a very important case. But as you mentioned, okay, so the U.S., which doesn't show up, also says we're not going to honor the decision. And so they never pay any remedy to Nicaragua. They don't stop the war, which is also what they're told to do. Mm-hmm. This is in 1986. The U.S. continues the Contra War up until the eve of the 1990 elections in Nicaragua in order to, again, terrorize the people into voting against the Sandinistas, which they reluctantly do. So the U.S. utterly disregards this. And again, the U.S. continues to disregard these things. The U.S. lost a case to Iran last year.
I didn't know this.
Yeah, so Iran took them to the International Court of Justice over U.S. sanctions. And the International Court of Justice in that case held that some of the sanctions the U.S. was imposing against Iran were unlawful, including based on a treaty of friendship that the U.S. signed with Iran many years ago. So again, the U.S.'s response to that case was, okay, we're backing out of the treaty of friendship with Iran. So that's gone. And also, by the way, we do not recognize the general jurisdiction of the International Court of Justice. We will continue to use it when we want to go after other people. And if someone wants to go against us, it'll be up to us to decide whether the court can proceed against us. We don't accept your jurisdiction anymore.
Yeah. The bravado is just, or machismo, whatever you want to call it, is just like out of this world. I mean, when you're looking at how the America behaves on the international scene.
Yeah, it's imperial hubris. And by the way, when I said that word, I want to just note something else. You know, they asked Jack Reed, who was a journalist, and he went to Russia and supported the Russian Revolution. He was friends with Vladimir Lenin, and Lenin once asked him, "Are you an American, Jack?" And he says, "Yeah, I'm an American." He says, "But are you an American?" And Jack says, "Yeah, and I guess I'm an American. I like pop culture. I watch NFL football, you know." Mm-hmm. But when I said the word imperial, it immediately made me think of Star Wars, right? In the Imperial Stormtroopers and the Empire. And I don't know if it's this book, but in other books I've pointed out, and I actually recently sent a post around this, And this was quite obvious to leftists in the 70s. But what many people don't realize is George Lucas, in writing Star Wars, envisioned that the rebels were the Vietnamese fighting the U.S. Empire. Vader. Right. Darth Vader was essentially Richard Nixon. Okay?
I had no idea.
Yeah. And this makes absolute sense.
Yeah.
This is correct. This is a correct way to view the world, and an obvious way to view the world. Most Americans, 99% probably thought, oh, we're the rebels, right? They represent us against some empire, maybe the Soviet Empire, or whatever they wanted to think, right? That isn't what Lucas thought. Lucas thought, no, this is the Vietnamese rebelling against the U.S. Empire. And it's fascinating, given that Star Wars is still relevant, still The Mandalorian, they're going to have a million of those shows and movies.
We love The Mandalorian.
Yeah, Yoda and everything. People don't realize we're the bad guys in this play, in this morality play.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
And I think, people have to get their heads around this. They got to start realizing we're the bad guys. We don't abide by international law. We run ripshod over this world.
Yeah. I've had that, talk about evolutions of, kind of coming to these conclusions within yourself. And I would say probably within the past year, I had the epiphany where I realized, like, oh my God, all of the fiction and nonfiction I've read that depict Chinese citizens or citizens of USSR or Russia, as like these just propaganda fed little cogs and wheels sort of. And, you as an American are, freedom. You're not like those people. You are live in a completely different country. And just in the past year, I've realized, like, holy shit, I'm like that person that I thought was over in Russia, and maybe still is, but that just realization that we are the bad guys is very profound, and something I think we should, as Americans, wrestle with a lot more. And I think because we have such great pop culture to distract us, people don't want to. But, every privilege that we have is because the U.S. has made it so essentially, diminishing and exploiting other countries so that we can have, all of the luxuries that we have. And I think it's important to really call that out and to remember, that the world exists the way it is in large part because America has, is this empire,
Yeah, and I want to get into, I think, we should talk about, you talked about, as one guy said, and I forget who said it, we're entertained to death in this country, and that it makes it easy not to see or to care. But it's even worse than that. The entertainment, Hollywood itself, is a propaganda machine. And that has to be pointed out, that Hollywood, and not just by accident, and we know this, and you're going to think I'm crazy, but Hollywood actually works very closely with the CIA in a lot of movies and shows. And the CIA has actually helped rewrite scripts, okay? And so is the Defense Department. And so a lot of what Hollywood does is promote U.S. imperialism. And I'll give a great example of this. And that's the movie Black Panther, which everyone thought was this real woke film, right? Because it had African-American superheroes for the first time in a blockbuster film. And that's great. I mean, I'm all for that, right? But then you have this weird thing. The only good white guy in it is working for the Central Intelligence Agency. I mean, literally for the CIA, not even a made-up agency, not a British, not the MI6. He literally is working for the CIA. And he's helping Wakanda against, this Malcolm X figure, and that's a whole nother issue. But he's the good guy, when in fact the CIA has done nothing but undermine undermine democracy in Africa. The CIA helped arrest Nelson Mandela in 1962. They helped murder Patrice Lumumba in Congo in 1960, and the list goes on. This is a cruel joke. But people watching that film will take away from that, especially kids, on a at least unconscious level, that the CIA is good. In fact, polls show that the CIA has a huge approval rating, particularly amongst liberals.
That's something that Mikey talks a lot about because, you know, he has his anarchist roots and stuff like that. And yeah, I just can't believe that liberals today are, you know, sorry, I sort of lost my train of thought because there's multiple. Oh, Mikey just popped on. Probably knows what I'm going to say.
I'm here. I mean, I mean, I have my radical roots, but what's crazy about it is that liberals also, most of my life, were very distrustful of the FBI and
they
the
should have
CIA.
been. Yeah.
Right.
Because the FBI and CIA were also doing things in the U.S. against progressives.
Killing Fred Hampton.
Infiltrating the peace movement, infiltrating the left. They're not our friends. And
the Iraq War. I mean, come on. This was like every liberal's worst nightmare. Abu Ghraib and the torture and all these things when I was, you know, a young man. And I was like, okay, these people are my allies on these issues. And now it's just like completely flipped. And they're like, yeah, let's invade everywhere. And the CIA is great. And maybe we should torture too, whatever, as long as they're Russians or whatever.
And Trump's a madman because they may want to get us out of Afghanistan before he leaves office. This is insanity.
Yeah, Trump's presidency definitely showed how non-ideological people are, or how out of sync with unprincipled.
How unprincipled they were.
Yes, absolutely.
That they may claim they care about peace, and they might when George W. Bush was president or whatever, but when he had Trump, who they hated, at least saying, and I'm not saying he was a great guy or that he was honest about what he was saying, but at least saying he wanted to end the wars, saying he wanted to bring troops home. He was condemned for this. This is pure madness. And, of course, what it leads you to think is that the liberals will support Biden in his next adventure. And you know, that adventure is going to come. Biden will invade some country. I hate to say that, but he's going to. And we have to educate ourselves, and we have to build a peace movement, and we need to oppose this.
Right, because we have never not seen a president invade a country or do some kind of campaign. I mean, you pointed out, like, even after Libya, right, there are still occasional bombs. Is that correct?
Yeah, well, the U.S. and NATO have continued to intervene, not only in Libya, but in Mali. So, and again, so NATO invades Libya and just blows the top off of the migrant crisis in Africa, helps spread radical jihad throughout northern Africa and into Syria, including into Mali, which had been peaceful. So now the U.S. has even recently invaded Mali, right? So we create all these problems. We unleash all these terrible forces, and then we say, oh, well, now we have to go invade another country because of all these problems that, by the way, we created. So, yeah, I mean, it's a never-ending thing. And if you look at that, I mean, Afghanistan, I know we don't have a lot of time left, but if you look at Afghanistan, for example, and Iraq, these are great examples where we do something, okay, and we create a problem that therefore we think requires additional military intervention. So in Afghanistan, very quickly, the U.S. supports the Mujahideen, including, which was led in part by bin Laden, right? Supports them to invade and terrorize Afghanistan in order to destroy a secular socialist government there that was aligned with the Soviet Union, and to draw the Soviets in, which happened, and undermine the Soviet Union, right? Well, so what happens? The Mujahideen end up successfully overthrowing the Afghan government. They take power for a while, and they're brutal, and they rape women, but they can't hold on to power because they're so crazy. So the Taliban ends up taking power, but they're pretty crazy too. And so then the U.S. says, oh, well, the Taliban's in power. We got to overthrow them.
Mm-hmm.
But why are they in power, right? And in the same thing in Iraq, right? So the U.S., of course, supported Saddam Hussein's takeover of Iraq, supported Saddam Hussein's use of chemical weapons in Iran and against the Kurds, right? And then we end up hanging the guy because he used chemical weapons against the Kurds. Right? But we invade Iraq twice, and ultimately, so what happens after the second invasion where we overthrow Saddam in 2003? Then we complain, oh, you know what? Iran is now too powerful relatively in the Middle East because
they bombed everywhere else.
We overthrew Saddam Hussein. So now we have to attack Iran. This is insane. Any rational human being who understood what is happening in these places would conclude that the United States is completely insane and that we are the rogue nation. We are the enemy of peace and security in the world. And it's not an overstatement to say that.
No, yeah, I thank you for saying it. I mean, we lead from hypocrisy, and I think one of the things you point out, you know, and especially in your chapter about feminism being, you know, I mean, we are, you know, not only destroying other countries physically, but the type of culture we're also spreading is horrific as well. And, you know, I think we come from, you know, sexist, homophobic culture in the United States, and, you know, seeing the horrific, you know, crimes against humanity, rape and whatnot against women and men. It comes from, you know, the underlings, the underbelly of our culture. And we're sort of just pushing it on other places. And it's disgusting to say the least. I mean, so there's more than just the physical violence. I mean, there's the devastation of civilization, the cities, their culture, but also pushing nasty underbelly aspects of our own culture across the world. And then, you know, as we've talked about, the propagandizing of it all to say that it's in everybody's best interest.
Right. Because and again, what it is, it depends on a belief, the presumption that we're morally superior to everyone else. That's what it comes down to. And so I want to get to your question now, because it is a $64,000 question before we end the program. You said, well, then what do we do?
Right.
To deal with all this?
Yeah.
Well, and first of all, I have some good news for you in that regard. It's only we Americans who can really do it. So first of all, we're privileged.
Yes.
Because we might have a chance at stopping this, because no other country can, and the UN cannot, and the US has made sure of that, right? We have to build a peace movement. And our main demand as people who care about human rights is to stop U.S. wars abroad. And we're the only people who can do that. We need to say no to this. We live in an ostensibly democratic country. It's an imperfect democracy, but we have some say over our government. We need to use that say to end these wars. We need to elect officials who oppose war.
And INGO leaders.
Yes. And that's what we can do. And that's a beautiful thing. If we lived in Luxembourg, you and I, we couldn't do a damn thing about it. Okay? We have the power here to do it, but we have to decide we want to do it. That's why I wrote this book. I mean, we have to decide that is the most important goal of someone who cares about human rights, is to stop U.S. war.
Absolutely. And quickly, what do we say to kind of the war hawks that have this idea that if America pulls out everywhere, we will be crushed in some way.
Yeah, I mean, there's just no evidence for this. I mean, we have one of the largest nuclear stockpiles in the world, maybe only 2 to Russia, though that's debatable. We're a very secure country. I mean, the reason we've never or rarely been attacked, what are the only times? The War of 1812, Pearl Harbor, which I can't even count. That was in Hawaii.
Right. We didn't own at the time.
Yeah, we wrongly took over. And then 9/11, right?
Mm-hmm.
The reason we're so rarely attacked, even before we had a nuclear arsenal, is because we have a landmass from the Pacific to the Atlantic. We're a very secure country, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's no one insane enough to want to invade the United States. This idea that, we're doing this for self-defense is just not true. And again, all these wars we're talking about are wars of choice. They're not brought upon us.
Mm-hmm.
We decide to do them. And yeah, sometimes there's backlash, again, like from Al-Qaeda, which we helped create. And then we go to war because of the monster we created. But the idea is stop creating these monsters. Pull ourselves back. We have a pandemic happening. We have infrastructure collapsing. Could you imagine if we brought all of our troops home and what we did is say, go build bridges?
I know.
Go to people's houses every week and give them food and give them masks. This is not a crazy idea. There are countries where that happens, right?
And I also think about the psychological effect that would have on a country, and especially in this time when you have so many people that do want to help, that feel helpless, that want to contribute to their neighbor, And as you pointed out in your book, there's so many studies that show most of Americans don't want to be in these wars anymore. We want to invest more in ourselves or just in positive things. So I think, hopefully we have a base to build this movement on. But
I think we do. I think it's there, and I think we just have to tap into it. And I think it also means reaching across the aisle to conservatives. The conservative movement has a very strong anti-war strain. And I think we can't be afraid to work with those people. If you ever look at the American Conservative magazine, it's the most anti-war magazine in America.
Really? Wow.
It absolutely is. And I think people need to find those people. I mean, here's again what gives me hope. I get invited to a lot of conservative talk shows to talk about these issues. They're interested in this.
Oh, wow.
And, again, I think the biggest fear the ruling class has in this country is that they love to see us just fighting each other. And, the fight is with the 1%. It's not between people in the 99%. And I think once we figure that out, I think we'll find that we have a lot in common, that 70% of the population wants Medicare for all. Most people, as you noted, want to end these wars. Chomsky's pointed this out for years. The surveys show that Americans are pretty progressive when it comes right down to the issues. And we need to find that common ground, and we need to take over this government,
Yeah. Hell yeah.
Hell yeah.
Well, thank you again for your contribution and for being on Contrarian Humanitarian. We're new, we're starting out, and we appreciate having such distinguished guests as yourself to enlighten us and kind of grow this movement. So,
thank you so much.
It was my pleasure, and I'll do it again. And
yes.
thank you, Aaron, and thank you, Mikey. I appreciate it.
Yeah, I have a whole list of questions and thoughts that I took from the book.
That'll be part 2.
Yeah.
Part 2.
Yeah, real quick. You have a new book on the way. Is that right?
Oh yeah, this is the book that'll destroy me. Yeah. I have a book called "Cancel This Book: A Progressive Case Against Cancel Culture," and all I'll say, I won't get into much of it, but it was inspired by a real life event in Pittsburgh where a long-term peace activist of 50 years was canceled by the peace and justice community because of a fairly innocuous Facebook post. And I this was not the book, as I say in my introduction, it's not the book I wanted to write, but I was like, okay, that enough is enough. And this is not the way to deal with these issues. So yes, that is coming out in April. And I probably will be canceled as a result. What are you going to do? As I say also in the book, Arundhati Roy, the author, who I love, she said once, the duty of a writer is to be hated. And I think I'm going to fulfill that duty with this.
Yeah. So. Well, relish in that. Yeah. Actually, you're onto something good.
Exactly. Thank you. Yeah. I really enjoyed this.
Oh, good. Us too. And yeah, definitely we'd love to have you back to talk more about this and your new book.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Awesome. Well, and happy holidays.
Happy holidays to you.
Yeah, enjoy the rest of your day.
You too. Thank you.
Take care, Dan.
Bye.
Okay, you too. Bye-bye.
Well, great.
That was awesome.
That was lawyer, author, and Professor Dan Kovalik speaking about his new book and much more. No More War: How the West Violates International Law by Using Humanitarian Intervention to Advance Economic and Strategic Insights. And what we've learned from him is that there is no such thing as humanitarian intervention in terms of legal terminology. So anytime you hear humanitarian intervention, that's a lie. And as Dan shows throughout his book, each humanitarian intervention, quote unquote, that the U.S. enterprise takes, thousands, millions have died. And again, that's why, we kind of preface this episode is that this is a serious subject, laughing and joking because, it's life and we have to get through it. But, we want to validate all the people that are not with us today because of these humanitarian interventions. People are still in the struggle. We're still in the struggle. And again, we kind of talked about propagandizing and pop culture and being distracted and how the top wants us to be distracted. And again, the reason for this podcast, the reason for being in dialogue with knowledgeable people about these issues is that we need to fortify ourselves and what is really happening in order for us to be strategic in how we beat the system, essentially, and do not allow the United States to engage in war. And like we were just talking about, there's plenty of surveys that show America doesn't want to be at war anymore. And we see the effects that it's having on us, economically and psychologically, I think. So, yeah.
Yeah, well, want to thank everybody who tuned in. We actually had a few people watching the live stream today. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody.
And we will put this up on YouTube for everybody to see very soon. Then we'll have an audio version. That'll be on SoundCloud, Spotify. We're looking to expand some platforms with that as well. Just want to, plug the pilot podcast real quick.
Yes.
Before our official episode started, we started this pilot episode to kind of get our feet under us and get ideas about how we wanted to do things. And we learned a lot. One of the things is that, it's the style we were doing in that is way too production intensive for us right now. So we're kind of behind on that, but I'm going to push it out as fast as I can, hopefully by the new year. And we have a bonus episode coming with a historian and professor of information and library science at Emporia State University, who's going to come talk about this part of the thesis of my whole thing in our pilot podcast, which is about the Nazi conspiracy theory, the Nazis as conspiracy theorists, and sort of some of the ideas I have about that. We're going to bring a little extra academic flair to that one with Professor Brendan Fay. So happy to announce that's coming. That's really all I have to say. I think we covered so much. A lot of what Dan talks about, I touch on in our pilot podcast series in sort of simple terms, but he really goes into much deeper detail, especially in the book. Aaron read the whole book in like 3 days, so it was
cover to cover, baby.
Cover to cover, yeah.
It was I can't recommend the book enough. And I did an ebook, and one of the things that I liked about that is that Dan puts citations after everything he writes, every statement he makes, and he actually puts a lot of excerpts. That's excerpts from experts. In his book that are talking about these same issues, as well as just some data pulled from different departments. And also when he gets into the international legal stuff, he puts a lot of the charters right there for you, and they're in the appendix. So anyway, you could do a lot of research yourself. It's a good book for that, is what I'm trying to say. So that's one thing I like about it. It's fairly easy to read in terms of language. He's very concise. Obviously, the subject matter is difficult to get through. But again, the citations and references make it great for you to kind of do your own research. So I encourage everybody to do that and to follow Dan and us, Contrarian Humanitarian.
That's right. Please, right now we're doing this totally out of pocket, and we're not asking for any kind of donations or monetization of any kind, no ads or anything at this time. In the future, we're going to have to do something like that to keep this project going. But for now, all we're asking is, tell your friends, click
love and support,
follow, share, retweet, all that stuff. So,
yeah, like we said in the beginning, I just finished my job I left IRC in June, and we decided, this is what we believe in, and this is what we're putting all of our heart and soul into it. And, we're just trying to get our footing, and hopefully next year we'll kind of formalize a bit and be able to accept donations if you feel so inclined, so we can keep doing this important work and grow it, because we have so many ideas. We're just getting started. But we appreciate all the love and support we've gotten so far. And please, if you have subscribed to our monthly newsletter, because the website launched in October, but we have not done a monthly newsletter. So we're going to do an end of the year newsletter, which will be out shortly. And then every month in the new year, we will actually have a real monthly newsletter. So just if you've been waiting, like, did I not get my monthly newsletter? No, you haven't gotten it because I haven't written it yet. So, but we'll get on that shortly and get that out to you. And yeah, hopefully grow our community more in the next year. So, and we also have we talked about DRC Congo a bit in this podcast, and we're going to have some amazing experts that are from the region and doing a lot of peace work and activism and know a lot about this region come and speak with us. So that will be very enlightening. So stay tuned for that as well. And yeah, I think that's the solace.
All right. I'm going to throw on our little outro vid. All right, y'all. Thanks for tuning in.
And if you love that song, man, intro, shout out to Franco Beats for
FGO Beats.
FGO Beats. Yeah, FGO Beats, not Franco. Yeah. Anyway, shout out to him. Roll it. Welcome to Contrarian Humanitarian, your blog and podcast for all things international development, analyzing global injustices and building solutions for a better world.